In this video, we want to explore the concept of theodicy. This is an important thing for us to think through in the wisdom books, and especially in the book of Job. Let me start with the definition. Theodicy is a theological exploration of the problem of evil and the presence of evil in our world. Why is there evil in our world if there's a good God that created it? And this term, theodicy, is derived from two Greek words. Theos, meaning God, and then dike, meaning justice or justify. So, in a sense, we're trying to justify God or trying to understand the justice of God in an evil world. And this takes place not just in Christian circles or in theological circles, this also takes place in philosophical circles. As an example of that, the 18th century philosopher David Hume, he said this, he said, "The biblical God cannot exist given the presence of evil and suffering in our world. God is all-powerful and all-good. However, given evil and suffering in our world, God cannot be both all-powerful and all-good." And this argument seemed rock solid at the time and has trickled down even into our modern era. We see contemporary examples of this kind of thinking, even by the great philosopher Lex Luthor in the Batman versus Superman movie. He says if God is all-powerful, he cannot be all-good, and if God is all-good, he cannot be all-powerful. And other ideas like this trickle throughout our society. What's a Christian supposed to do with statements like that? And how are we supposed to understand our world in light of arguments like that? Well, Tim Keller has answered this by saying that there's a hidden premise in the statement that because evil and suffering are in our world, God cannot be both all-powerful and all-good. There's a premise that's actually snuck into that statement. And the hidden premise is this: because I can't see any point to evil and suffering, there must not be a point to it. An example that Keller gives is a man who breaks his leg. And he might be wondering, why did this happen? Why did I have to go to the hospital unnecessarily and suffer in this way? But let's say that that man goes to the hospital and he meets his future wife there, as he meets a nurse or he meets a doctor. And now something good actually came out of that evil. Well, similarly, and this takes us to the book of Job. I know we've taken a circuitous route to get there. Job experienced suffering, but there was a greater purpose behind that suffering that God was orchestrating behind the scenes. Now, we are privy to that because we read in the prologue of the wager that God made with Satan, but Job is not privy to that. And so what we see in the book of Job is that God has a purpose for suffering, even if we don't know why we're suffering at the time. He's orchestrating the events of humanity to bring about a greater good, ultimately. The truth is that human understanding is too limited to understand God's deeper purposes in our world. And it takes a divine creator, it takes a cosmic understanding of everything that's going on to see the deeper purposes in our world. That's why we have to have faith and trust God through that. God has purposes for evil and suffering in our world and in our lives, and we are not always privy to why God does the things he does and why he allows the things that he does. We can trust God and his purposes to bring about a greater good. Romans 8:28 speaks to this, if I can go New Testament for a second. And speaking of the New Testament, I think the greatest example of theodicy in action for a good purpose has to go to the greatest suffering experienced by God taking on flesh and dying among us. What greater tragedy is there in this world? What greater injustice is there in this world than that God would take on flesh, live among us, and we would put him to death? And yet we know that through that, God has actually accomplished a greater purpose. And that purpose was to save us from our sin.